The genius Viking food hacks that kept them alive without refrigeration. The Viking kitchen without cold. The north wind howled through the fjords, rattling the wooden beams of a longhouse. Outside, snow and frost blanketed the world in white, sealing the earth in ice for months at a time. There were no markets to restock from, no ships arriving with barrels of grain from warmer lands. Once the sea froze over and the storms raged, you were on your own, and if your food spoiled, your family wouldn't live to see the spring. Yet the Vikings didn't just survive these months, they thrived. They feasted through the Yule season, they welcomed guests with meat, cheese, and drink, and they fought the long winter not with hunger, but with cleverness. All without the luxury of refrigeration. No ice boxes, no cold cellars with humming generators, no easy way to just store it in the fridge. Instead, the Norse people mastered techniques so ingenious, so perfectly adapted to their brutal environment, that their food could last months, sometimes years, without spoiling. They turned scarcity into abundance, transforming nature's threats into tools for survival. This is the story of how the Vikings kept themselves alive in a world that seemed determined to kill them, using food hacks so effective they could still work today. Part 1. Meat without a fridge. The Viking art of preservation. Meat was the Viking warriors' fuel, dense in calories, rich in protein, and essential for surviving the cold. But fresh meat lasts only days before rot sets in, and in winter, hunting wasn't a daily option. So the Vikings needed methods that could keep meat edible for months. Their first secret weapon was drying. Once an animal was slaughtered, cuts of meat were sliced into thin strips and hung high inside the longhouse, where smoke from the central hearth curled around them day and night. The smoke didn't just cook it, dried, flavored, and protected the meat from insects and bacteria. This gave rise to rakt kjøtt, or smoked meat, which could last through an entire winter without turning rancid. But drying alone wasn't enough. In coastal communities, Vikings relied heavily on salting. Salt was precious and often imported through trade, but when it was available, it became a shield against decay. Meat was layered with coarse salt in wooden barrels, drawing out moisture and preventing bacterial growth. It could be eaten as is in emergencies or rehydrated in stews for better taste. In the far north, where salt was scarce, another method emerged: fermentation. Viking cooks would pack fish or meat into airtight containers, sometimes burying them underground. Over weeks, natural bacteria would transform the food, creating a tangy, pungent flavor and preserving it for months. This technique gave us dishes like rakfisk, fermented fish, which might make a modern diner's eyes water, but to a Viking, it was a life-saving delicacy. And when all else failed, the winter itself was the refrigerator. Meat could be stored in frozen pits dug into the permafrost, wrapped in animal hides to protect it from scavengers. If a particularly harsh freeze set in, the meat could remain frozen for the whole season, ready to be thawed over the fire when needed. The result? A Viking warrior could ride into battle, or a farmer could tend the fields in February knowing his household wouldn't go hungry. Meat preservation wasn't just a culinary trick, it was a survival strategy that allowed the Norse to push further, raid longer, and endure what would have broken weaker civilizations. Part 2. Fermentation. Turning spoilage into survival. To the untrained nose, the Viking longhouse could be a strange place. A haze of smoke curled from the fire, mingling with the sharp, tangy scent of fermenting food. To a modern visitor, that aroma might signal something had gone terribly wrong, but to a Viking, it was the smell of security. Fermentation was one of the most powerful preservation methods in the Viking arsenal. Instead of fighting the natural process of decay, they learned to control it. In doing so, they created foods that could last months, even years, without spoiling, and often became more nutritious in the process. The science they didn't know they knew. The Vikings didn't understand the microbiology behind fermentation, but they knew from experience that certain processes transform perishables into something that wouldn't kill you, and in fact, would make you stronger. By creating environments where beneficial bacteria could flourish, harmful ones were kept at bay. Fish was the most common candidate for fermentation, especially in coastal communities. One classic method involved gutting and cleaning the fish, then packing it tightly into wooden barrels or earthen pits, layering it with salt when available. If salt was scarce, they'd rely on the fish's own brine, sealing the container to keep out air. Over weeks or months, naturally occurring lactic acid bacteria would break down the flesh, giving it a sharp, tangy flavor. The result was dishes like rakfisk, fermented trout, and the infamous hakarl in Iceland, fermented Greenland shark. The latter, toxic when fresh due to high levels of urea, became safe to eat only after months of controlled decomposition. To a Viking, this wasn't gross. it was proof of mastery over the environment. Fermented dairy, the Viking energy bomb. Fermentation didn't stop at fish. Dairy, especially from cows and goats, was also transformed into longer-lasting, nutrient-rich staples. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, but by letting it sour naturally and separating it into curds and whey, the Vikings could produce skyr, a yogurt-like cheese, or soured milk that could survive for weeks without refrigeration. Skyr, high in protein and fat, was a Viking superfood. Warriors could carry it on long journeys, mixing it with water to create a portable drink or eating it straight for quick energy. Soured milk was also used in cooking, adding flavor to breads and porridges while extending the shelf life of the meal itself. Vegetable fermentation, greens for the winter. In the short Nordic growing season, fresh vegetables were precious. But fermentation allowed the Vikings to keep greens on the menu long after the harvest. Cabbage, turnips, and carrots could be chopped, salted, and stored in barrels to create tangy, probiotic-rich dishes similar to sauerkraut. These provided vital vitamin C during the winter, preventing diseases like scurvy long before anyone knew what a vitamin was. Fermentation as a cultural anchor. Fermented foods weren't just about survival, they became part of Viking identity. Certain preparations were associated with festivals, others with long voyages, and some were considered warrior food eaten before battle for strength. The process itself was communal, families and neighbors working together to prepare and store the food, sharing the bounty when the time came. Fermentation turned the fear of rot into a calculated gamble that the Vikings had learned to win, and every tangy bite was proof that nature could be outsmarted if you had the patience, the skill, and the stomach. Part 3. Drying, smoking, and the power of the longhouse hearth. If fermentation was about working with bacteria, then drying and smoking were about keeping them at bay entirely. The Vikings mastered these techniques so completely that a single good summer of preservation could mean the difference between feasting through the winter or facing starvation by February. The longhouse as a preservation machine. A Viking longhouse wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a living, breathing preservation chamber. At its heart burned an open hearth, day and night, every day of the year. This fire did more than cook meals or keep the family warm. The constant smoke slowly drifted upward, curling through the rafters where meats and fish hung from wooden racks. The smoke contained compounds like phenols and formaldehyde that naturally inhibited bacterial growth. The low heat drove out moisture, preventing mold and rot. This slow smoking could take days or even weeks, but the results were legendary. Meat that would stay edible for months and sometimes over a year. Drying, the wind's role in preservation. The Vikings also harnessed another natural resource, the cold, dry Nordic air. In coastal villages, racks of fish and strips of meat were hung outside in the open wind. This was particularly common with stockfish made from cod or haddock. The fish were gutted, cleaned, and spread out to dry under the winter sun and wind for weeks. No salt, no fire, just nature's own refrigerator. The frigid air stripped away moisture while keeping insects at bay. When done right, stockfish could last for years, becoming so hard it needed to be pounded with a hammer before cooking. Drying was also used for berries and herbs, which were critical for adding flavor and vitamins to winter meals. Lingonberries, crowberries, and wild bilberries were dried on woven mats near the fire or on flat stones in the summer sun. The meat vault of the North. Some Viking farms constructed small smokehouses or used separate outbuildings specifically for preservation. In these spaces, meat could be cold smoked over weeks without cooking, locking in flavor and longevity. Game meats like venison and elk were common in the interior regions, while coastal communities relied heavily on smoked fish such as herring, salmon, and eel. This preserved protein was crucial for long sea voyages, where cooking fires were dangerous and food needed to survive weeks of damp sea air. Smoking as a flavor of identity. Beyond survival, smoking gave Viking cuisine a distinct character. Guests could often tell where a family came from by the smokiness of their meat or the type of wood they used. Birch and alder were popular for a milder, sweeter smoke, while oak provided a more robust, almost bitter edge. This wasn't just food, it was a form of edible geography, carrying the scent and flavor of home. A winter without fear. Thanks to the longhouse hearth and their mastery of air and smoke, Vikings didn't just survive the cold months they entered them prepared. Shelves and racks groaned under the weight of smoked meat, dried fish, and preserved berries. Every bite was a reminder that no matter how brutal the winter outside, The fire within the longhouse and the knowledge passed down through generations would keep them alive. Part 4. Salt, Brine, and the Ocean's Secret Pantry. When you live in a world without ice boxes, you either learn to think like nature, or you die trying. The Vikings, blessed and cursed by their proximity to the sea, developed an entire preservation philosophy based on one powerful mineral: salt. Salt, more precious than silver. In the Viking Age, salt wasn't something you sprinkled casually onto a boiled egg. It was a treasure, often more expensive per weight than silver in some inland markets. While coastal communities could collect it more easily, those living far from the ocean relied on trade, exchanging furs, amber, or iron for small sacks of the precious crystals. Salt was the ultimate enemy of decay. By drawing moisture out of meat and fish, it created an inhospitable environment for bacteria. The Vikings didn't need to understand microbiology. Their centuries of experience told them salt meant safety. Brining, the liquid fortress. One of the most effective techniques was brining, soaking meat or fish in a strong saltwater solution. Barrels of brine could preserve entire catches of herring, allowing them to be transported hundreds of miles inland without spoiling. These barrels were heavy, expensive, and worth their weight in life itself during a harsh winter. The Vikings also experimented with herbal brines, adding juniper, dill, and even wild garlic to improve both preservation and flavor. This practice not only extended the shelf life, but also created some of the earliest forms of pickling in Scandinavia. The salt pans of the north. In some areas, especially in Denmark and parts of southern Norway, the Vikings produced their own salt using salt pans, shallow clay, or metal containers placed over fires. Seawater was poured in, boiled, and evaporated until only the crystalline treasure remained. This was labor-intensive and fuel-hungry, but for many communities, it was worth it. In Iceland, where trees were scarce and firewood was precious, they often relied on geothermal springs to evaporate seawater, a brilliant adaptation that saved both time and resources. Salted cod, the voyager's lifeline. Salted cod became a staple for long journeys, especially raids, trade voyages, and exploratory missions. Packed tightly in barrels and layered with salt, this fish could survive for months in the damp hull of a ship. Sailors often ate it boiled or tore off strips to chew as a sort of early protein ration. This food wasn't just sustenance, it was insurance. In stormy seas when fishing was impossible, salted cod kept hunger at bay and morale afloat. The marriage of salt and smoke. The most secure method, combining preservation styles. Vikings often salted meat or fish first, then smoked or dried it afterward. This belt and suspenders approach meant the food could last for astonishing lengths of time, sometimes until the next harvest. This dual preservation became essential in years when crops failed, game was scarce, or fishing nets came back empty. It also created flavors so intense that even centuries later, many traditional Scandinavian recipes still echo these salty, smoky beginnings. Salt as a symbol. Salt wasn't just about food, it carried cultural weight. Sharing salted meat or fish with guests was a sign of wealth and preparedness. A host who could set out well-preserved delicacies in the dead of winter demonstrated not only generosity but also competence as a provider. For the Vikings, salt was life, a mineral pulled from the veins of the earth and the waves of the sea, transformed by human ingenuity into the invisible guardian of their survival. Part 5. Dairy alchemy, turning milk into Viking gold. If meat and fish were the Vikings' battlefield rations, then dairy was their quiet, dependable ally, the food that kept children growing, warriors strong, and winters bearable. The Norse knew how to transform fresh, perishable milk into long-lasting treasures that could outlive the season it came from. They didn't have cheese factories, butter churners powered by electricity, or pasteurization. What they had was skill, observation, and patience. Milk was never wasted. Viking farmers kept cattle, goats, and sheep not just for meat, but for their milk. Fresh milk spoils quickly, especially in summer, so they worked fast to transform it into forms that could be stored. In warm months, the surplus from daily milking went straight into cheese-making vats or fermentation pots. In colder months, the smaller amounts produced were often consumed as thick, sour milk, a tangy, protein-rich drink that could keep for days without refrigeration. Skyr, the Viking yogurt. One of the most ingenious dairy creations of the Norse was skyr, a thick, cultured dairy product still eaten in Iceland today. Think of it as somewhere between yogurt and soft cheese. How it worked. Warm milk was mixed with a bit of leftover skyr from a previous batch, acting as a starter culture, then left to ferment at room temperature. Once thickened, the whey was drained off and the remaining curds were stored in wooden tubs or skin bags. Why it lasted. Skyr's acidity made it unfriendly to bacteria, allowing it to last far longer than fresh milk. Why it mattered. Skyr could be eaten fresh or dried into hard blocks, which could be rehydrated in water or broth months later. This wasn't just food, it was a portable, compact, protein-packed survival tool. Hard cheeses for the long haul. Cheesemaking was a preservation magic trick. By separating curds from whey and pressing them into solid blocks, Vikings created a product that could age for weeks or months. Hard cheeses, salted and dried, became the long-term dairy storage method of choice. They could be taken on voyages, grated over meals, or sliced into travel rations. Some Viking-aged cheeses were so hard they had to be scraped with a knife rather than cut. Butter, the Viking gold. To the Norse, butter was more than food. It was currency, trade goods, and in some cases, even an offering to the gods. Fresh cream was churned into butter, then packed into airtight wooden tubs or clay pots and stored in cool cellars, bogs, or buried underground. Salted butter could keep for months, but in colder climates like Iceland, even unsalted butter lasted a long time if kept in sealed containers. Some sagas mention bog butter stored in peat bogs, where the cool anaerobic conditions acted like a primitive refrigerator. Archaeologists have even found bog butter from the Viking Age still intact, though tasting it is not recommended unless you enjoy archaeological dares. Whey, the forgotten lifeline. The leftover liquid from skyr or cheese-making whey wasn't wasted. It was acidic, slightly sour, and acted as a preservative. Meat stored in whey lasted longer, and whey-based drinks were common among poorer households. In Iceland, whey was stored in barrels and used throughout the year as both a drink and a marinade. Its tangy flavor found its way into soups, breads, and stews. Why dairy was a survival pillar. Dairy gave the Vikings something priceless, a renewable food source. Cows, goats, and sheep kept producing milk as long as they were healthy, meaning fresh food was available even in times when fishing failed or hunting was scarce. For children, dairy was one of the few year-round sources of protein and calcium. For warriors, it was a way to build muscle and keep strength without depending solely on meat. Cultural weight of dairy. In the sagas, offering someone the best cream or richest cheese was a sign of honor. Dairy was part of Viking hospitality, given to travelers alongside bread and ale. It wasn't just nutrition, it was a mark of care and wealth. Part 6. Brewing the Seasons, How Fermented Drinks Kept Vikings Alive. When we picture Viking feasts, we imagine horns of mead and mugs of ale, but to the Norse, fermented drinks weren't just party fuel. They were a survival strategy disguised as celebration. Brewing allowed the Vikings to turn fragile ingredients into something that could be stored for months, transported across oceans, and drunk without fear of illness. Why fermentation was a lifesaver. Water in the Viking Age wasn't always safe to drink, especially near settlements where waste could seep into streams. Alcoholic drinks, even at low strength, were much safer because fermentation killed harmful microbes. And beyond safety, fermentation was preservation. Grain that might mold if stored damp could be turned into beer and kept far longer. Honey, rare and precious, could be made into mead that lasted years. Fruit harvests could be fermented into wine before they spoiled. Beer, the everyday drink. Viking beer wasn't the heavily hopped beverage we know today. It was mild, cloudy, and often flavored with herbs like bog myrtle or yarrow. This drink was lower in alcohol than modern beer, often only 2 to 4%, making it a safe, hydrating beverage for everyday life. How they brewed it. 1. Barley or rye grains were soaked, sprouted, and dried, creating malt. 2. The malt was crushed and mixed with hot water in wooden tubs or clay vessels. 3. Herbs were added for flavor and preservation. 4. Yeast, sometimes carried over from a previous brew, was added to kickstart fermentation. Within a week, they had drinkable beer that could keep for weeks or months in sealed barrels. Mead, the drink of the gods. Mead was liquid gold both because honey was valuable and because it could be stored for years. Made from honey, water, and yeast, mead was often reserved for feasts, rituals, and warriors returning from raids. For long voyages, mead was ideal. It didn't spoil, it provided calories, and it boosted morale. Some recipes included herbs or fruit for medicinal purposes, turning the drink into a form of Viking health tonic. Fruit wines and berry ferments. In summer, Scandinavia exploded with berries: lingonberries, cloudberries, bilberries. Fresh berries spoiled quickly, but fermentation turned them into something lasting. Berry wines, often low in alcohol, were stored in ceramic jugs or skin bags and drunk in winter as a rare sweet treat. The sugar in the fruit helped preserve it naturally. Kvass, the poor man's brew. Not everyone could afford barley or honey. For poorer households, kvass, a mildly alcoholic drink made from fermented bread, was a practical solution. Bread scraps were soaked in water, fermented, and flavored with herbs. The result was a tangy, slightly fizzy drink that could be made year-round. Preservation in liquid form. The brilliance of Viking brewing was that it transformed vulnerable food into liquid calories. A barrel of beer could last a season. A jug of mead could last a decade. A skin of berry wine carried the taste of summer into the dead of winter. Fermented drinks were lightweight compared to storing equivalent calories in solid form, making them perfect for long-distance trade and raiding expeditions. Ritual and morale. Drinking together was more than hydration, it was bonding. Sharing a horn of mead before battle or during the dark midwinter nights kept spirits high. In sagas, refusing a drink could even be seen as an insult. Alcohol wasn't just about survival, it was about social cohesion. Part 7. Bread, porridge, and preserved grains, Viking staple foods that never went bad. If meat and fish kept the Vikings strong, grains kept them alive. In fact, without barley, rye, and oats, Norse society would have struggled to survive the long Scandinavian winters. Grain was the backbone of the Viking diet, not just because it provided calories, but because it could be stored for years if treated properly. The challenge of grain storage. In the Viking Age, there were no climate-controlled silos. Grain was stored in wooden bins, clay-lined pits, or woven baskets, all vulnerable to pests, moisture, and mold. The Norse had to master clever techniques to keep their stores edible until the next harvest. Their main tricks included drying the grain thoroughly before storage, sometimes over a low fire or in the warm attic of a longhouse, keeping it off the ground to avoid dampness and rodents, sealing storage pits with clay and straw to make them airtight, smoking the grain in some cases, adding an extra layer of preservation. Barley, the Viking powerhouse. Barley was the most important grain in Viking Scandinavia. It grew quickly, tolerated poor soils, and could survive in the cool, short summers. Barley was eaten boiled, ground into flour, or brewed into beer. In winter, barley porridge was the ultimate comfort food. A thick pot of it could be stretched with bits of meat, dried berries, or even seaweed. It was filling, warm, and endlessly adaptable. Rye, the winter bread grain. Rye bread was a staple in many Viking households. It was denser than modern bread and often slightly sour, thanks to natural fermentation. Rye's biggest advantage was its ability to grow in colder, harsher conditions than wheat. Rye flour was sometimes mixed with barley or oat flour for better texture. For long journeys, the Vikings baked rock-hard travel bread that could last for months if kept dry. It wasn't pleasant to chew. Some sailors reportedly softened it by dunking it in beer or broth, but it was virtually indestructible. Oats, the forager's grain. Oats thrived in wetter soils and were beloved for their flexibility. They could be eaten as porridge, ground into flour, or fed to livestock. Viking oat porridge, cooked with a pinch of salt and sometimes flavored with herbs or berries, was a quick, hot meal for farmers before heading into the fields. Porridge, the daily fuel. While bread was common, porridge was more universal. It required no oven, just a pot over the fire. Grains were boiled with water, milk, or broth until thick and creamy. Leftovers could be fried into cakes for the next meal, a zero-waste approach that ensured nothing was thrown away. During feasts, porridge could be enriched with butter, cream, honey, or even mead, transforming it from a humble dish into something decadent. Sprouted grain storage. The Vikings also understood that sprouting grains before storage was a risk. It meant the grain could spoil faster. But controlled sprouting, malting, was used deliberately for beer making and, in some cases, to soften older grain for easier digestion. Emergency grain rations. For lean times, some families prepared grain bricks tightly packed, fire-dried blocks of crushed barley or rye. These could be grated into soups or porridges months later. On ships, they were as valuable as dried fish or salted meat. Symbol of stability. Grain wasn't just food, it was wealth. A household with full grain bins was considered secure, while an empty bin meant hunger was on the horizon. In some sagas, disputes over stolen grain led to blood feuds, underscoring how vital it was. The legacy of Viking ingenuity in the kitchen. The Vikings may be remembered for their swords, longships, and daring raids, but the truth is this: none of those feats would have been possible without the quiet genius of their kitchens. These men and women didn't have refrigeration, supermarkets, or industrial tools, yet they mastered the art of keeping food fresh in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Through fermentation, they turned fish into a year-round protein source. Through smoking and drying, they preserved meat for months. Through salting, root cellars, and honey preservation, they kept fruit, vegetables, and dairy from spoiling. And through creativity and absolute refusal to waste even the smallest scrap, they ensured every harvest, hunt, and foraging trip fed their people for as long as possible. This was more than survival, it was strategy. A well-fed crew could sail further. A stocked winter storehouse meant fewer desperate raids. And a community that could endure the cold months without famine could grow stronger with each passing year. We might take our refrigerators and supermarkets for granted, but in many ways, the Vikings were the ultimate food preservation pioneers. They understood the science even if they didn't call it that, and lived by the rhythm of the land and sea. Their knowledge was born out of necessity, sharpened by hardship, and passed down through generations. So the next time you open your fridge, remember 1,000 years ago, a Viking would have done the same thing. Only their fridge was a dark cellar, a salted barrel, or a smoky hut. And somehow, it worked just as well. Because in the end, the Vikings didn't just conquer with their weapons, they conquered the cold with their food.